So good evening and welcome. I'm Robert Polito, Director of the New School Graduate Writing Program, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this special program with Natasha Trethaway and Metta in collaboration with our dear friends at Cave Canem. In Metta we have a poet, fiction writer, collage artist, and essayist. And Natasha Trethaway has been one of my favorite poets ever since I first read her book, Belloc's Ophelia, back in 2002. That, of course, was her second book, so I caught up with her first, domestic work, the recipient of the first 1999 Cave Canem Poetry Prize. And I've been reading her with pleasure and wonder and admiration ever since, through Native Guard and Thrall. And I think that's something I can safely say about everybody here, too, that we've been reading her with pleasure and wonder and admiration for a long time. I want to thank everyone at Cave Canem for making tonight possible, especially Allison Myers, and I wonder if we might have a round of applause for Allison. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Hafiza Jeter, Program and Communications Coordinator of Cave Canem, who will introduce the evening more fully. Hafiza.
Hi, good evening. I want to thank you all for coming, for joining us for the New York City launch of Thrall by Cave Canem faculty and United States Poet Laureate Natasha Trethaway. I would also like to thank our hosts and co-sponsors, the New School for Public Engagement, especially Robert Polito and Lori Lynn Turner of the School of Writing. And final thanks to our founders, the Mrs. Giles Whiting Foundation and the New York State Council on the Arts. Opening the evening for us is Cave Canem fellow Metta. She would be followed by Natasha Trethaway, and we will close the evening with a Q&A facilitated by Metta. Metta is a poet, professor, activist, painter, collage artist, fiction, and essay writer. She's the author of South of Here from New Issues Press, published under the name Lydia Melvin, and her work has appeared in numerous journals. She received her MFA in creative writing from Western Michigan University and her PhD in English with an emphasis in creative writing at SUNY Binghamton. Welcome to the stage, Metta.
Hi, good evening. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here, and it's wonderful for me to be back in New York. I've moved to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and when I was coming back in the cab, I just suddenly thought, oh, this is the first time I've been home in, 6 weeks or something. And that was a very strange thing to feel because I typically don't feel like I have a home. So, I can kind of say warmly, it feels great to be back home. Thank you for this invitation. So I'm just going to start reading some poems, and I really doubt that I'm going to pause in between. Medea Medusa, the body a myth. Not the bones. I felt blood, the story's last weathered vapor. Child, when you were more than cooling ash, when were you more axe than the hurt of a splitting tree? Sometimes it is me I dream, liminal, bodied, unbooked. Cracked marble street. Child, what haunts your spirit more? Knowing the axe before it met your neck, or knowing the axe would meet you, one wound or another. I remember the year heart's glass-sharp casing recast its sand-blemished past. I'd already met each of you in previous books. Look, my arms, they never belonged to me. There was a year of burnished fallings, of felonious wings, cracking. It was dusky that year. Every night, every night, the same waiting, the eyes midnight cliffs, not yet bound to his promise of blindings. And there was me, and there was the story of me. Even now as I sit here, wounded, worried, worded, child, what can I do but grow, tentacled with worry? Every night, every burnt out night, I wait for some child to dip his foot in the sea, to shiver under the eye of my cave. Child, I am cracking, cracking, cracking. Rosa Ingram murders Georgian farmer, 1948. mother, wife of, servant, sibling, daughter, Rosa. Woody Guthrie ballad, a Black history marker, a mere footnote. Georgia, Georgia, the whole day through. You, quiet, haint, prick your ring finger on stubborn cotton, or you, a weapon, silver, slicing cane, flickering in night, an insect floating, charged, wired, your lone rage revved, the rumbling in your children's bellies piercing like engines clamoring through fields, tone-deaf mantras pushing you from sleep to labor, a sharecropper, then slow pay or no pay at all. Rosa, I wonder, strain my ears for a glimpse of your music. I wonder if you sang that night. Did you? So I will give you a little bit of background about this poem. I was at the Virginia Center for Creative Arts, and I went to the cemetery in Lynchburg, Virginia, that has a section that is kind of like the slave section. And it was a very strange cemetery. I actually enjoy cemeteries quite a bit, in part because of their strangeness, but this was like the strangest one I'd ever been to. There's a swing in a tree, you know, for you to just kind of go and swing, and there are bees. So I guess if there's a beekeeper that's there. And then this cemetery for previously enslaved Africans. And so I just kind of thought that all of this collision was very interesting, as well as, you know, just to kind of be in the South, to be in Virginia, and I'm from the South, and to kind of think about what it meant for me growing up in the South amongst these similar kinds of collisions. So this poem comes from being at that cemetery. Swing at your own risk. Chicken, you are whitened, stiff, your sculpted frame frozen, your stomach a gourd, quarter broken, head tilted on a whitewashed tree of colored bottles, branches stuffed in their necks. In the cemetery, bees, I'm sure, squeeze some measure of joy out of their nectar-heavy mouths. Honeybees, field bees, pollen bees, painted white boxes, hand-planted flowers, every bee populating Lynchburg, Virginia, suck, pollinate, share. No split oppositions, no broken necks. A 6-pack's leftover polyethylene around a black-necked stilt's newly strangled neck. Your hands sometimes welcomed around my neck. In the cemetery, the man tells me his grandfather's hands sometimes tighten the ropes around weeping necks. Bitumen-stained mouths, unnatural disasters, slaves buried on one side of the cemetery, Confederates' flags mark their own headstones' necks. Everything is painted here, even the chains on this quaint tree swing, come with no memories, no branched backs, no trees exposing necks. Lately summer. Your tongue's thick-fisted vowels, truncated actions, abstracted, rehearsal of moan. What lies rooted, knotted, beneath your tongue's callous muscle? Psalm and light. I want, always, knowledge of suns, burning, always bearing, weight, tongue. I want your cleanest light. The dirty consonants of fingers you can take, fear mistaken as unrequited sharp passion and love, sudden gangly gasp, delight, unpunctured instinct, unfurled stamen, my mouth when it meets your mouth, my pleasure when it meets, numb. In your mouth, I am out. I once touched that mouth, stroked your singular lines. My pleasure when it meets rain and God. It is raining, dear. The wind's strong, the rain hard, the rain again. Sometimes you are harder still, your eyes still, still. Okay, so this poem has a blank space that is bracketed in gull wings. So I'll just do that so that you know that that there's a blank space. And then sometimes that blank space towards the end of the poem gets filled by only smaller. And so instead of doing that in only smaller, I'll just do something else. Okay. But you desired. You remind yourself you desired it for so long. When you finally got it, you always got it. You repressed yourself, forever wanting. You employed desire. You took the desired thing in your hand and stroked you, pulled it against your mouth and spoke nonsense. You named it. You choked on this desired thing. You spat on, wept on, located its weakness. You exploited, exposed. Back to its original state, its shocked face, wanted, needed, weeded out. Oh, look at you. Split into a larger, vainer, wasteful you. A smaller you turns into a tightly coiled question mark, slips into your mouth, stumbles on your tongue, and neatly dances down your throat. You, only smaller, goes, one day, you, only smaller, will implode, this outside you, this nameless thing that desires, the undesired. Is this it, you ask, getting what you want? Is this it, you ask, getting what you want? Is this it? Thank you.
Where's Metta? Those were wonderful. Thanks for coming all the way from Baton Rouge to be part of this. Thrall is a fire that burns us, a fire that illuminates, an extraordinary book that deconstructs language at its core. Language's power to write consciousness, its terrors, its possibilities. We read Thrall's Book of Castas and understand the oppressor's reality is in thrall to a word, a phrase, mestizo, castizo, mulatto turning backwards, and symbiotically, this taxonomy is in thrall to the terrible enactment of brutality. In the hands of the oppressor, over and over, naming creates the other. But words are equally the poet's arsenal. Her recording of history and everyday acts, her acute ways of seeing, constitute an excavation, a digging beneath an exposure of racist representations. The project she sets herself to journey through is painful, intensely personal, and ultimately a transformational work of art. Throughout this compelling collection, we hear a voice fully realized, feel the presence of a penetrating, passionate intellect. Here is a courageous writer facing down history, exposing its cruelties in clear-eyed images. Thrall's construction is purposive, propelling, its logic inescapable. Linda Gregerson describes this relentless progression as serial shocks of historical and personal discovery. David Baker as a necessary tale to tell and retell. Thrall expands and forever deepens our understanding of what poetry can and must achieve. As you've heard, Natasha Trethaway's debut collection of poetry, Domestic Work, was selected by Rita Dove for the 1999 inaugural Cave Canem Poetry Prize for the best first work by an African-American poet. She is the author of Native Guard, for which she won the 2007 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Belloc's Ophelia, named a notable book for 2003 by the American Library Association, and Beyond Katrina, a meditation on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Natasha has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Study Center, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Bunting Fellowship Program of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. She is the State Poet Laureate of Mississippi and at Emory University, the Charles Howard Candler Professor of English and Creative Writing. What a thrill it is to have Natasha with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming the 19th United States Poet Laureate, Natasha Trethaway.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for coming. Metta, it was so great to meet you and to have you come from my neck of the woods, for me to also meet you in your neck of the woods. Thank you, Cave Canem, for hosting this book launch and the new school, and all of you for being here. I am going to read then tonight from Thrall. Thrall is, well, there's probably nothing I can say better than what Allison just said about it. That was a lovely introduction. Thank you. For me, it's very much a book about knowledge and the ongoing presence of the past, and a meditation on the difficult history of ideas about race across time and space. In it, I try to examine deeply ingrained and often unexamined notions of inherent difference, notions that are manifest in larger public discourses and even in the smaller relations within families. By considering historical figures, photographs, and paintings from the 17th and 18th centuries, religious imagery on altarpieces, and in narratives dating back to the 13th century, I try to make sense of our shared history, what we've inherited from the past, as well as my personal history with my black mother and white father, a story that is quintessentially American. Elegy for my father. I think by now the river must be thick with salmon. Late August, I imagine it as it was that morning, drizzle needling the surface, mist at the banks like a net settling around us, everything damp and shining. That morning, awkward and heavy in our hip waders, we stalked into the current and found our places, you upstream a few yards and out far deeper. You must remember how the river seeped in over your boots and you grew heavier with that defeat. All day I kept turning to watch you, how first you mimed our guide's casting, then cast your invisible line, slicing the sky between us. And later, rod in hand, how you tried again and again to find that perfect arc, flight of an insect skimming the river's surface. Perhaps you recall I cast my line and reeled in 2 small trout we could not keep. Because I had to release them, I confess I thought about the past, working the hooks loose, the fish writhing in my hands, each one slipping away before I could let go. I can tell you now that I tried to take it all in, record it for an elegy I'd write one day when the time came. Your daughter, I was that ruthless. What does it matter if I tell you I learned to be? You kept casting your line, and when it did not come back empty, it was tangled with mine. Some nights, dreaming, I step again into the small boat that carried us out and watch the bank receding, my back to where I know we are headed. This poem takes as its starting point the Mexican casta paintings that were painted across the 18th century in colonial Mexico to represent the mixed blood unions that were taking place in the colony. I was interested in them because not only were they made in series of 16 that began with the white Spaniard father, but also that the representation of mother, father, and mixed race offspring was also represented with the actual taxonomies created to name these mixed blood children. I was also interested in the idea that when you were born a mixed blood, a casta, in colonial Mexico, your name was recorded at birth in the Book of Castas. There was an idea that in many ways has come down from there to us even now about indigenous blood, that over a few generations can be purified to whiteness, but that the taint of African blood is irreversible. So you had names like mulatto returning backwards, hold yourself in midair, and I don't understand you. This is after a series by Juan Rodriguez Juarez, circa 1715. Taxonomy. 1. De Español y de India produce mestizo. The canvas is a leaden sky behind them, heavy with words, gold letters inscribing an equation of blood. This plus this equals this, as if a contract with nature or a museum label, ethnographic, precise. See how the father's hand beneath its crown of lace curls around his daughter's head. She's nearly fair as he is. Calidad, see it in the brooch at her collar, the lace framing her face. An infant, she is borne over the servant's left shoulder, bound to him by a sling, the plain blue cloth knotted at his throat. If the father, his hand on her skull, divines, as the physiognomist does, the mysteries of her character, discursive, legible on her light flesh, in the soft curl of her hair, we cannot know it, so gentle the eye he turns toward her. The mother, glancing sideways toward him, the scarf on her head, white as his face, his powdered wig, gestures with one hand a shape like the letter C. See, she seems to say, what we have made. The servant, still a child, cranes his neck, turns his face up toward all of them. He is dark as history, origin of the word native. The weight of blood, a pale mistress on his back, heavier every year. 2. De Español y Negra produce mulatto. Still, the centuries have not dulled the sullenness of the child's expression. If there is light inside him, it does not shine through the paint that holds his face in profile, his domed forehead, eyes nearly closed beneath a heavy brow. Though inside, the boy's father stands in his cloak and hat, it's as if he's just come in or that he's leaving. We see him transient, rolling a cigarette, myopic, his eyelids drawn against the child passing before him. At the stove, the boy's mother contorts, watchful, her neck twisting on its spine, red beads yoked at her throat like a necklace of blood, her face so black she nearly disappears into the canvas, the dark wall upon which we see the words that name them. What should we make of any of this? Remove the words above their heads, put something else in place of the child, a table perhaps, upon which the man might set his hat, or a dog upon which to bestow the blessing of his touch, and the story changes. The boy is a palimpsest of paint, layers of color, history rendering him that precise shade of in-between. Before this, he was nothing, blank canvas, before image or word, before a last brushstroke fixed him in his place. 3. De Español y Mestiza produce castiza. How not to see in this gesture the mind of the colony. In the mother's arms, the child, hinged at her womb, dark cradle of mixed blood, call it Mexico, turns toward the father, reaching to him as if back to Spain, to the promise of blood, alchemy, 3 easy steps to purity. From a Spaniard and an Indian, a mestizo. From a mestizo and a Spaniard, a castizo. From a castizo and a Spaniard, a Spaniard. We see her here, one generation away, nearly slipping her mother's careful grip. 4. The Book of Castas. Call it the Catalogue of Mixed Bloods, or the Book of Not Spaniard, not white, but mulatto returning backwards, or Hold Yourself in Midair, and the Morisca, the Lobo, the Chino, Sambo, Albino, and the No Te Entiendo, the I Don't Understand You. Guidebook to the colony, record of each crossed birth, it is the typology of taint, of stain, blemish, sullying spot, that which can be purified, that which cannot, Canaan's black fate. How like a dirty joke it seems. What do you call that space between the dark geographies of sex? Call it the taint, as in it taint one and it taint the other. Illicit and yet naming still what is between. Between her parents, the child, mulatto returning backwards, cannot slip their hold, the triptych their bodies make, in paint, in blood, her name, written down in the book of castas, all her kind, in thrall to a word. Some of you may already know that my father is also a poet, and this next poem makes use of a line from a poem of his. It's after a chalk drawing by J.H. Hasselhorst, 1864. Knowledge. Whoever she was, she comes to us like this. Lips parted, long hair spilling from the table like water from a pitcher, nipples drawn out for inspection. Perhaps to foreshadow the object she'll become, a skeleton on a pedestal, a row of skulls on a shelf. To make a study of the ideal female body, 4 men gather around her. She is young and beautiful and drowned, a Venus de Medici risen from the sea, sleeping. As if we could mistake this work for sacrilege, the artist entombs her body in a pyramid of light, a temple of science over which the anatomist presides. In the service of beauty, to know it, he lifts a flap of skin beneath her breast, as one might draw back a sheet. We will not see his step-by-step parsing, a translation, Mary or Catherine or Elizabeth to corpus, areola, vulva. In his hands, instruments of the empirical, scalpel, pincers, cold as the room must be cold, all the men in coats trimmed in velvet or fur, soft as the down of her pubis. Now one man is smoking. Another tilts his head to get a better look. Yet another, at the head of the table, peers down as if enthralled, his fist on a stack of books. In the drawing, this is only the first cut, a delicate wounding, and yet how easily the anatomist's blade opens a place in me, like a curtain drawn upon a room in which each learned man is my father, and I hear again his words. I study my crossbreed child. Misnomer and taxonomy, the language of zoology. Here he is all of them, the preoccupied man, an artist, collector of experience. The skeptic angling his head, his thoughts tilting toward what I cannot know. The marshaller of knowledge, knuckling down a stack of books. Even the dissector, his scalpel in hand like a pen poised above me, aimed straight for my heart. Now, this next poem is about the miracle of the black leg. And the miracle of the black leg is a myth of a miraculous transplant performed by physician saints, the patron saints of medicine, Cosmas and Damien, involving always a black donor and a white recipient, in narratives dating back to the 12th century and pictorial representations dating back to the mid-14th century. These representations appear in several Greek narratives, a Scottish poem, as well as paintings and altarpieces in several countries, including Spain, Italy, Germany, Austria, Belgium, Switzerland, France, and Portugal. One of the things that was a delight for me in what might seem like a macabre kind of poem is to discover that in the original Greek, that little black leg, that little piece cut off, is the word comma, the original with a K. Miracle of the black leg. 1. Always the dark body hewn asunder. Always one man is healed, his sick limb replaced, placed in the other man's grave, the white leg buried beside the corpse or attached as if it were always there. If not for the dark appendage, you might miss the story beneath this story. What remains each time the myth changes. How, in one version, the doctors harvest the leg from a man 4 days dead in his tomb at the church of a martyr. Or, in another, desecrate a body fresh in the graveyard at St. Peter in chains. There was buried just today an Ethiopian. Even now, it stays with us. When we mean to uncover the truth, we dig, say, unearth. 2. Emblematic in paint, a signifier of the body's lacuna, the black leg is at once a grafted narrative, a redacted line of text, and in this scene, a dark stocking pulled above the knee. Here, the patient is sleeping, his head at rest in his hand. Beatific, he looks as if he'll wake from a dream. On the floor beside the bed, a dead Moor, hands crossed at the groin, the swapped limb white and rotting, fused in place. And in the corner, a question, poised as if to speak the syntax of sloughing a snake's curved form. It emerges from the mouth of a boy like a tongue, slippery and rooted in the body as knowledge. For centuries, this is how the myth repeats. The miracle in words or wood or paint is a record of thought. 3. See how the story changes. In one painting, the Ethiop is merely a body, featureless in a coffin so black he has no face. In another, the patient at the top of the frame seems to writhe in pain, the black leg grafted to his thigh. Below him, a mirror of suffering, the blackamoor, his body a fragment arched across the doctor's lap as if dying from his wound. If not imminence, the soul's bright anchor, blood passed from one to the other, what knowledge haunts each body, what history, what phantom ache? One man always low in a grave or on the ground, the other up high, closer to heaven. One man always diseased, the other a body in service, plundered. 4. Both men are alive in Violdo's carving. In twinned relief, they hold the same posture, the same pained face, each man reaching to touch his left leg. The black man on the floor holds his stump. Above him, the doctor restrains the patient's arm as if to prevent him touching the dark amendment of flesh. How not to see it? The men bound one to the other, symbiotic, one man rendered expendable, the other worthy of this sacrifice. In version after version, even when the Ethiopian isn't there, the leg is a stand-in, a black modifier against the white body, a piece cut off, as in the origin of the word comma, caesura in a story that's still being written. This is after a photograph from The Americans by Robert Frank. Help, 1968. When I see Frank's photograph of a white infant in the dark arms of a woman who must be the maid, I think of my mother and the year we spent alone, my father at sea. The woman stands in profile, back against a wall, holding her charge, their faces side by side, the look on the child's face strangely prescient, a tiny furrow in the space between her brows. Neither of them looks toward the camera, nor do they look at each other. That year, when my mother took me for walks, she was mistaken again and again for my maid. Years later, she told me she'd say I was her daughter, and each time strangers would stare in disbelief, then empty the change from their pockets. Now I think of the betrayals of flesh, how she must have tried to make of her face an inscrutable mask and hold it there as they made their small offerings, pressing coins into my hands. How, like the woman in the photograph, she must have seemed, carrying me each day, white in her arms, as if she were a prop, a black backdrop, the dark foil in this American story. This is another Costa painting poem with an epigraph that reads, After de Albina y Español nace torna atrás. From albino and Spaniard, a return backwards is born. Anonymous, circa 1785 to 1790. Torna atrás. The unknown artist has rendered the father a painter, and so we see him at his work, painting a portrait of his wife, their dark child watching nearby, a servant grinding colors in the corner. The woman poses just beyond his canvas and cannot see her likeness, her less than mirror image coming to life beneath his hand. He has rendered her homely, so unlike the woman we see in this scene, dressed in late century fashion, a chicador, mark of beauty in the shape of a crescent moon affixed to her temple. If I say his painting is unfinished, that he is yet to make her beautiful, to match the elegant sweep of her hair, the graceful tilt of her head, has yet to adorn her dress with lace and trim, it is only one way to see it. You might see instead that the artist, perhaps to show his own skill, has made the father a dilettante, incapable of capturing his wife's beauty, or that he cannot see it, his mind's eye reducing her to what he's made, as if to reveal the illusion immanent in her flesh. If you consider the centuries' mythology of the body, that a dark spot marked the genitals of anyone with African blood, you might see how the black moon on her white face recalls it, the rosita she passes to her child, marking him torna atrás. If I tell you such terms were born in the Enlightenment's hallowed rooms, that the wages of empire is myopia, you might see the father's vision as desire embodied in paint. This rendering of his wife, born of need to see himself as architect of truth, benevolent patriarch, father of uplift, ordering his domain. And you might see why, to understand my father, I look again and again at this painting, how it is that a man could love and so diminish what he loves. You know, I think it was perhaps Thomas Jefferson who first called for, in Notes on the State of Virginia, a kind of comparative anatomy, the dissection of Negroes in order to determine what he imagined was the essence of racial difference and thus inferiority. This is Dr. Samuel Adolphus Cartwright on Dissecting the White Negro, 1851. To strip from the flesh the specious skin, to weigh in the brain pan seeds of white pepper, to find in the body its own diminishment, blood deep and definite, to measure the heft of lack, to make of the work of faith the work of science, evidence the word of God, Canaan be the servant of servants, thus to know the truth of this derelict corpus, a dark compendium, this atavistic assemblage, flatter feet, bowed legs, a shorter neck, so deep the tincture. See it? We still know white from not. Calling, Mexico, 1969. Why not make a fiction of the mind's fictions? I want to say it begins like this: the trip, a pilgrimage, my mother kneeling at the altar of the Black Virgin, enthralled, light streaming in a window, the sun at her back, holy water in a bowl she must have touched. What's left is palimpsest, one memory bleeding into another, overwriting it. How else to explain what remains? The sound of water in a basin I know is white, the sun behind her, light streaming in, her face as if she were already dead, blurred as it will become. I want to imagine her before the altar, rising to meet us, my father lifting me toward her outstretched arms. What else to make of the mind's slick confabulations? What comes back is the sun's dazzle on a pool's surface, light filtered through water, closing over my head. My mother, her body between me and the high sun, a corona of light around her face. Why not call it a vision? What I know is this: I was drowning and saw a dark Madonna. Someone pulled me through the water's bright ceiling, and I rose, initiate, from one life into another. I think some of you must be familiar with those phrases like touched by the tar brush or somebody in the woodpile that suggest the presence of black blood. The term mano prieta also refers to that. Mano prieta. The green drapery is like a sheet of water behind us, a cascade in the backdrop of the photograph, a rushing current that would scatter us, carry us each away. This is 1969, and I am 3, still light enough to be nearly the color of my father. His armchair is a throne, and I am leaning into him, propped against his knees, his hand draped across my shoulder. On the chair's arm, my mother looms above me, perched at the edge as though she would fall off. The camera records her single gesture. Perhaps to still me, she presses my arm with a forefinger, makes visible a hypothesis of blood, its empire of words, the imprint on my body of her lovely, dark hand. So I'm going to finish up now with, I think, 3 more poems. Sailors in the Canadian Navy, officers wear the tattoo of the fouled anchor to suggest the hardships that they go through on ship. Fouled. From the next room, I hear my father's voice, a groan at first, a sound so sad I think he must be reliving a catalog of things lost. All the dead come back to stand ringside, the glorious body of his youth, a light heavyweight, fight ready and glistening, that beauty I see now in pictures. Looking into the room, I half imagine I'll find him shadow boxing the dark, arms and legs twitching as a dog runs in sleep. Tonight, I've had to help him into bed, stumbling up the stairs, his arm a weight on my shoulders, so heavy it nearly brought us down. Now his distress cracks open the night. He is calling my name. I could wake him, tell him it's only a dream, that I am here. Here is the threshold I do not cross. A sliver of light through the doorway finds his tattoo, the anchor on his forearm, tangled in its chain. Rotation. Like the moon that night, my father, a distant body, white and luminous. How small I was back then, looking up as if from dark earth. Distant, his body white and luminous, my father stood in the doorway. Looking up as if from dark earth, I saw him outlined in a scrim of light. My father stood in the doorway as if to watch over me as I dreamed. When I saw him outlined, a scrim of light, he was already waning, turning to go. Once he watched over me as I dreamed. How small I was. Back then, he was already turning to go, waning like the moon that night. My father. When I was trying to finish this book, I knew that because my father had taken me to Monticello for the first time over 20 years ago, that in order to finish the book, I had to take him back there. And so last summer we went to Monticello and noticed how many things had changed. One of the specific changes was that whereas there wasn't much talk of Sally Hemings the first time, I think after all the amazing work that Annette Gordon-Reed has done, it is now the official position of the foundation that Thomas Jefferson fathered at least 2 of Sally Hemings' children. When you walk in now, the docent, this is one of the first things that the docent says. Enlightenment. In the portrait of Jefferson that hangs at Monticello, he is rendered two-toned, his forehead white with illumination, a lit bulb, the rest of his face in shadow, darkened as if the artist meant to contrast his bright knowledge, its dark subtext. By 1805, when Jefferson sat for the portrait, he was already linked to an affair with his slave. Against a backdrop blue and ethereal, a wash of paint that seems to hold him in relief, Jefferson gazes out across the centuries, his lips fixed as if he's just uttered some final word. The first time I saw the painting, I listened as my father explained the contradictions, how Jefferson hated slavery, though out of necessity, my father said, had to own slaves. That his moral philosophy meant he could not have fathered those children, would have been impossible, my father said. For years, we debated the distance between word and deed. I'd follow my father from book to book, gathering citations, listen as he named, like a field guide to Virginia, each flower and tree and bird, as if to prove a man's pursuit of knowledge is greater than his shortcomings, the limits of his vision. I did not know then the subtext of our story, that my father could imagine Jefferson's words made flesh in my flesh, the improvement of the blacks in body and mind in the first instance of their mixture with the whites, or that my father could believe he'd made me better. When I think of this now, I see how the past holds us captive, its beautiful ruin etched on the mind's eye, my young father, a rough outline of the old man he's become, needing to show me the better measure of his heart, an equation writ large at Monticello. That was years ago. Now we take in how much has changed. Talk of Sally Hemings, someone asking, how white was she? Parsing the fractions as if to name what made her worthy of Jefferson's attentions, a near-white quadroon mistress, not a plain black slave. Imagine stepping back into the past, our guide tells us then, and I can't resist whispering to my father, this is where we split up. I'll head around to the back. When he laughs, I know he's grateful I've made a joke of it, this history that links us, white father, black daughter, even as it renders us other to each other. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for those poems. That was really quite wonderful.
Thank you.
Very damning and haunting. You know, I think the way that Southern poems go.
Right. There's a lot of damnation that needs to come down, like rain.
I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then we'll open it up for the audience to ask questions. And there are microphones that are out there. So can everybody hear us? Do you want to?
Can you hear me?
Okay, great. So in each of your poetry collections, with the exception of Belloc's Ophelia, is it Belloc?
Belloc.
Mm-hmm. Belloc's Ophelia, the historical and kind of public past moves intimately alongside the private, personal past. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how you see the public past and the private, personal intersecting, and what's the importance for you of bringing these two worlds into the same kind of house?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me start by saying that even in Belloc's Ophelia, there is that merging. No, I was not a prostitute, but when you, of course, write a persona, you give to that persona some of your own interior life. Mm. And so, in many ways, putting on the mask of a persona, as many of you must know, allows you actually to tell more truth than you might without that mask. You know, it's kind of like at Mardi Gras or Carnival. You get behind a mask and people will do all kinds of things they wouldn't have done. And so in that way, I think that might, for me, be one of the most intimate, deeply personal books I've written, even though it's all about a persona, simply because I have given to her my own experience of growing up Black and biracial in the Deep South, of being stared at, of being looked at as a curiosity, the way Ophelia is. Some of the things, some elements of her relationship to her mother and even to her father come out of some twists of my own experience. But of course, the reason that these things are melded always for me is, what the feminist movement told us, that the personal is always political. It's always historical, too. We are always historical beings, sort of caught up within the continuum of history. And I write to make sense of not only myself, but my place in history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is so readily apparent in Thrall. I was quite taken by the poems like The American's Knowledge and Torna Atrius, that you begin with these paintings and pull your family into these paintings, and kind of take the paintings out into the world.
Right.
Like that was really quite startling for me to see how you did that with such ease.
Thank you. Some of the poems, and I think mostly the way I've worked before is through juxtaposition, that I've wanted to have, here's this poem right here, and then this one will be next to it, and you'll see it. But the poems you mention are ones in which I'm trying to do that juxtaposition within the same poem.
Right.
So that Torna Atras, goes on until the last two lines, seemingly about a painting.
Right.
But of course, the discovery of the end is also discovery for me. I was compelled by that painting, but didn't know why until I saw my father in it at the end of that poem.
Very interesting. So you have clearly, I think, a deep interest in photographs. Many of your books look at photographs themselves. And so could you talk about your attraction to the stilled image? And do you see the photograph and the poem as twin arts?
I do. I think that the photograph, that still, is how the image has always worked in my imagination. Even as a child, I would take snapshots of the world around me, the places that I saw, and record them as imagery like that in the stills. And of course, the poem allows you to animate those stills, the way a film, once it gets, those old films, once they start moving, and you see the pictures whizzing by. But I can't begin a poem without making a photograph of it in my head, of creating that kind of image that is there just for a moment, which then allows me to think not only of an actual photograph, but even in my own memory, what has been cropped, what has been intentionally left out, what has been erased because of necessary forgetting, what happened just before or after. The photograph, the image is always that to me.
Yeah. I think that when you were reading, I was thinking about the poem in Domestic Work, where you're with your grandmother at the beach, and how that poem itself feels like, part of it, you're looking at a snapshot and you're thinking back on it, but when you take that snapshot and breathe life into it, that too feels like some of those cropped moments. And it felt very, in some strange ways, like a kind of WPA shot, which some of those shots in that book seem to look at as well.
Right.
And then in Thrall, you're, kind of putting that painterly gaze on the family.
Well, I think that the poem that you mentioned from Domestic Work, because I actually, writing it had those two photographs side by side, and really the poem just began in that kind of comparison, not only of the images themselves, but also the two historical moments.
Right.
So again, it's that same juxtaposition, same place, same beach, 40 years apart, or no, more than 40, 50 some years apart.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you talk about this risk in or these cropped images, that when you're composing your poems and that you're cropping these images and thinking about what's there and what's kind of not there, what's not present, and of course that space in between, which comes up quite a bit in Thrall. I'm wondering about this risk of recording actions in the act of, sharing an intimate moment, so that you have a couple of poems in Thrall where, you apologize for being like, in this intimate moment with your father and kind of recording it, or you and your dad out somewhere and you're both searching for metaphors to encapsulate the scene, So I'm wondering like what that risk is, what that tension is.
Well, I think, as I say in that first poem, there is a ruthlessness to the fact of not simply living in a moment, but also thinking about how it will be made use of later on for art. And I learned this from my father, who my whole life, there would be moments where he would stop listening to me, pull out a notebook and write something down. And I thought, oh my God, what did I just say? What is going to be in a poem one day? So, and I think that bothered me in some ways. But I learned it myself too. And I learned, what you learn is that he was the one writing things down, so he had the power of story. And so not until I would write things down did I have any control over the narrative, or could my narrative stand in contention with his, vying for, dominance in a sense. But also, I understand that that's always a tricky thing, which is why I have a poem that begins, and I think this has been my project in many ways all along. Why not make a fiction of the mind's fictions? I'm trying to tell you, maybe you shouldn't even trust how I remember this to you. But the point of doing that is not necessarily to cast myself in this unreliable light, but it is indeed to consider and to make use of Yeats's idea that of the quarrel with others we make rhetoric, of the quarrel with ourselves poetry. And so even as I'm accusing my father of certain things, I've got to, in those poems, reckon with my own culpability as someone who was doing some of the similar things.
Right.
Trying to tell the truth, but knowing that my own forgetting, willed or not, is going to always change the story.
Right. That's very, very wonderful. So I think that, should we open this up to the audience at this point? Are there, where are the mics? Oh, the mics are there. So if you just raise your hand, they'll bring a mic to you. There are two people over on this side.
Hi. I just wanted to say my personal favorite line is the way you end the poem, aimed straight for my heart.
Mm-hmm.
I found it to be so utterly personal, and at the same time, I could almost imagine the two of you sort of with pens at desks facing each other.
Right.
And it made me wonder, if I may ask you, so how did it feel when you first realized that you too would follow and be a poet, and did you feel conflicted? Did you feel happy? Did you feel proud? It must have been, because of reading all the rest, it must have been not, I don't imagine it was so easy.
Well, it's kind of like what I was saying about the necessity for having a voice, having an agency in the telling of the story. That image, that whole poem is, including the line from a poem of my father's that he wrote when I was probably 4 years old. The feeling of being the observed, the feeling of being sort of helpless on the table as, men of knowledge and science are trying to dissect and figure out what you are or who you are. I think I grew up feeling like that. And so, and feeling written by my father. That last image is about him being able to write and what that feels like to be written by someone else and not having the power to write the self. I think when I made the decision, it probably felt like a necessity that I was going to enter the conversation and that things that I was going to say were going to have a lot of weight to them as well.
Thank you.
Hi. I just wanted to return to the topic of persona real quickly. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could talk about maybe how, or even if you feel kind of a responsibility to the persona that you're portraying in different poems, and how that affects the writing of it.
Mm-hmm. For the most part, up until a poem that's in this book, I always chose, or two poems in this book, I should say, I chose to imagine personas, to create possible people out of historical facts. I hadn't actually engaged yet in putting words in the mouth of someone who'd lived, who'd actually existed. And that made me feel that I wasn't doing a disservice to an actual human being or their descendants or, anything. And it gave me a sense of trying to find in the poem the integrity of the voice. That integrity comes from not only an attention, I think, to history, but also to attention to my own impulses, to what it is I'm giving to the character. And because I'm creating that persona from my own interior life, I feel like it's true. It's deeply true. Writing the personas that are in this book. I mean, there's the Samuel Adolphus Cartwright. Here I am. Here's an actual scientist who was actually dissecting some people. And I render him a little hysterical, but I think that what he was doing actually renders him a little hysterical. I mean, I try to make use of that kind of scientific language, so to be true to the language that would have been in his writing. And then the other one is a little harder. I mean, maybe the farther we get from a particular historical figure. So I write in the voice of Juan de Pareja. Who was the slave of Diego Velázquez, later a painter himself. All I really have of him is the painting that he made. And so for me to try to imagine his voice is really to sort of give him my own experience also. But what's interesting about trying to create something that could be true about him was that, there's the painting that Velázquez did of him, which is called Juan de Pareja. It was he did it as an experiment to get ready to paint the Pope. And then there's the portrait that Juan de Pareja did, in which he inserts himself in the painting, The Calling of St. Matthew. And the biggest thing that I noticed was that Velázquez's painting of him, he had big, wide eyes, and he looked kind of innocent. And, when we think of what this means to look like this, but when he painted himself, he looked like this, which a narrowing of the eyes always suggests a kind of wisdom, a shrewdness. And so thus I have a line, to make myself, I looked at how my master saw me, then I narrowed my eyes. So he knows more than perhaps his master does about who he is. What I also give to him is that sense of apprenticeship, because he was working in Velázquez's studio. He was a kind of apprentice, watching him paint, grinding colors. It's not unlike the apprenticeship that I went through as a daughter of a poet, watching, then knowing that I was going to also step in and create something out of that experience. Really, this is always the case. I found in Juan de Pareja, I found in the Native Guard, I found in Ophelia people who might help me speak to some of my own experience. And that's what a persona is for me. But I don't want to simply make mouthpieces of them. So they have to have, in some ways, their own agency, which is why in Belloc's Ophelia, she leaves the book and I don't even know where she goes. That she had to have her own life beyond the boxes that not everyone had put her in. Photographers, her father, the poet who wrote about her. She had to escape me as well. So maybe one more, and then we can...
Here in the front.
I have about 1 million questions that I'd like to ask you, but I'm going to ask you two. What was the word that inspired you for knowledge that was from your father's poem? And do you do any research on any of these poems? They sound very historically researched.
Lots of research, yes. I mean, I find that that's fun to me. I don't trust what I know only. I want to know something else, and to have my poems undergirded by this knowledge that reaches outside of myself. In the poem knowledge, it is the line, the entire phrase, I study my crossbreed child. Not one word, but that whole
line.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming out and sharing this event with us. Thank you to Cave Canem and New School for hosting, and to Natasha.